All right, welcome back now to Chapter 6 of When the Night Comes Falling, a Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders by Howard Blum. And I had originally hoped that this book was going to be showing multiple perspectives and showing multiple different ideas. It's not. It doesn't appear to be that way at all. It appears to be purely a book showing how Bryan Kohberger is the guy. So I don't know that there's another book out there. If there is, I would love to get that. But for now, we're going to go ahead and continue with Howard Blum's book. But I'm going to say that more and more it's clear where the direction of this entire book's going to go. It's not going to all of a sudden switch to go, okay, now that we've looked at it's possibly him, let's look at if it was possibly somebody else. It doesn't look like it's ever going to do that. The next section, which is part 2 of the book, is called The Children, which already predisposes the mind to this horrible thing happened to children. And everybody, of course, hates anything happening to children. So the whole book is just pretty much a one-sided narrative of why Bryan Kohberger is the guy. And so I think, though, however, we can still glean some pieces of information. There is details that Howard Blum has uncovered that perhaps, again, take it with a grain of salt, because I don't think he's being unbiased. He's definitely being biased when he wrote this book. In my opinion, but at least we can glean some new information to have a discussion point. And I'm going to try to do my best to offer some counters to some of these things, just because it's so one-sided that I feel like I have to play devil's advocates now with Howard Blum's book. So let's continue, and this will be a relatively short chapter as we finish part 1 of the book, which was, I think, called Michael's Story, which is Michael Kohberger, Bryan Kohberger's father. Next section, part 2, will be called The Children. Then we're going to have a major section on the prosecution and on forensics, and a little section, it seems like, on the defense and Bryan Kohberger's side of the things, or which they call the hunter, I think. So again, very, very biased. And most of the weight's towards the prosecution and the victims, with a little section on the hunter, which I'm sure is prejudicial, and a little bit on the defense, which I'm sure is going to be prejudicial and showing how they're just trying to get their guy off, even though he's guilty of sin. So let's continue with this. This chapter appears to document mostly a narrative that Howard Blum is going to try to spin, in my opinion. And mainstream media has gone with it as well. It's the same narrative I saw in 2012 with James Egan Holmes and the shooting of the Aurora, Colorado, that a brilliant person, a brilliant student, suddenly is failing out of school, and that causes him to snap. That's the same kind of narrative I hear going here. So we know Bryan Kohberger was a brilliant PhD candidate. He was one of only 2 people that his professor recommended to the PhD candidacy program, and so he has a brilliant mind, and he never had any problems in academics. From what we can tell, he had to have high grades to get into the PhD program. So he's a great student, and that's all we ever hear. However, now they're going to paint the narrative in chapter 6 that Bryan Kohberger was having problems with school and was about to get kicked out and lose school, and that probably was part of the impetus for making all these things come to a head. It's the typical narrative. Everything points to the fact that he's a brilliant, bright student, but we have to have a narrative that says he was failing. He was failing in school, which wasn't academically. It was because of this narrative that we're going to hear here, which is, again, a falling out between a professor and Bryan Kohberger over the way that certain female students were handled in the class, suggesting that Bryan Kohberger had it out for women in particular, and that he was being reprimanded by his professor repeatedly. This has been in the media a lot. I'm sure they got it mostly from Howard Blum, that he was having problems with his professor over the way that he graded female students' papers. And the gist of it is, to cut to the chase before we read select paragraphs, is that Bryan Kohberger was about to lose his teaching assistants, and that is a necessary part of his financial aid. And so, in other words, everything would crumble. If he got kicked out of the TA position, helping grade papers for undergraduate students, then there goes his funding, and there goes his ability to stay in school. And so he was going to be kicked out of school, essentially, is what so this is a snowball effect. Bryan Kohberger realized that his world was crumbling apart. He got to WSU first semester, and already in the first semester he's about to get kicked out of school because of this whole kerfuffle. That's a great word, kerfuffle, with some female students. Even before starting classes in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at WSU on August 22nd, this is 2022, he had already written to the Pullman, Washington Police Department applying for an internship. Here they're going to prejudice you with how arrogant he was, doing his best to sound like an academic in the making. Bryan sent an email stating that he had an interest in assisting rural law enforcement agencies with how to better collect and analyze technological data in public safety operations, which, according to Howard Blum, when translated means he had expertise expertise in gathering evidence from surveillance camera videos, checking out cell phones that had pinged off of nearby towers, and the crime had gone as the crime had gone down, and running relevant license plate numbers through an all-knowing law enforcement computer systems. There are several prejudicial things that Howard Blum is trying to set up here. He's trying to suggest, and I'm sure he's going to go into it, this idea that a female student on camera or on campus accused Bryan Kohberger of hacking into her surveillance cameras. So now it's talking about he tells them that he's good at helping collect and analyze technological data when he's applying, which means, according to Howard Blum, that he can hack into people's surveillance cameras, check out cell phones that ping off of towers, which again is going to be relevant in the whole crime, because a whole big part of the case, as we know right now, is cell phone tower pings, where he was at which given time, which is ironic. I want to say, pay attention to this. It is ironic that Howard Blum is going to suggest that Bryan Kohberger is an expert of cell phone tower pings, and yet makes the mistake of getting pinged on cell phone tower pings all over Moscow, Idaho, around the residence of 1122 where the murders go down, and somehow, you know, he's a master of it, and yet makes the mistake of having his phone ping off of those locations. So again, which one do you want to have it? Is he a brilliant student, or is he a failing student? Is he brilliant at knowing how cell phone towers work, or is he an idiot because he didn't turn off his phone or he allowed himself to get pinged? Which one do you want to have it? So if you're cherry picking your evidence, you always cherry pick what you want and you ignore the counter, and I'm here to provide the counter. I guess the devil's advocate, right? And so we cover that. And so he was basically also suggesting it was a little arrogant. Like, he's not teaching the police anything they don't already know, but he wants to make it sound like he needs to teach them how to use common surveillance techniques that all police departments know how to use. So he's trying to show Bryan Kohberger as an awkward, egotistical, arrogant guy that doesn't have anything to offer, essentially. Because that's what basically what it boils down to. So then it talks about this odd thing. Again, Howard Blum just picks and chooses which side he wants to present. So you already know Howard Blum has set up in an earlier chapter that Bryan Kohberger went to a pool party and hit on women, if you will, or smoozed women and males at the party, and got two women's phone number. He got two girls to give them their phone number. So which one is it, Mr. Blum? Is he good at social stuff, or is he an incel loner that can't get along and doesn't get along with people? So now we find out that there was 13 new students in the doctoral program, and Bryan Kohberger sought them all out. It was a charm offensive, as Howard Blum talks about it. Now this is crazy. So Bryan Kohberger makes an effort to go meet the other candidates in the doctoral program and make friends. And Howard Blum spins it as a charm offensive. It is all a show. It's all an act, according to Howard Blum. Please understand, according to Howard Blum. So let's talk about what's really happening. Bryan Kohberger is not some reclusive incel who can't make friends. He's going out making friends. He's getting girls' phone numbers at a party. He's going out and meeting all the other students. But Howard Blum is still going to spin it somehow as he's socially awkward and putting on a show, a charm offensive, putting on his newly acquired hail fellow persona as he diligently made the rounds and introduced himself. And he clearly enjoyed being this carefully recreated Bryan. He had never felt so free, so confident. He had flung off the indignities of his past life. Again, Howard Blum wants to remind you that Bryan Kohberger used to be a drug addict when he was 16 and in high school. He used to have a drug problem. So now all of a sudden what we have is he's now confident. Where does he get this from? I don't know. Did he have a conversation with Bryan Kohberger? I doubt it. Howard Blum is literally, in my opinion, making up fiction right here. He's just, he was proud of himself, and he's got a new reinvented Bryan. It's a show. It's a charm offensive, as he says. This is utter horseshit, if you ask me. Again, I'm not saying Bryan Kohberger is innocent. What I don't like is this utter horseshit, which is taking a fact that he's going out there, getting girls' phone numbers and making friends and trying to get to know the other doctoral programs. He's being social and acting somehow like he's still antisocial, reclusive, doesn't have friends, and nobody likes him. Which one is it? Which one is it? So anyways, then he uses somebody called Ben Roberts here to show us that something was wrong with the way that Bryan Kohberger reached out to friends, and this is his evidence. He definitely seemed a little more eager than some of the others to go around and introduce himself, Ben Roberts, a fellow criminal justice grad student, would recall with what seems like admiration. Okay, so this guy's admitting He's good at going around to his fellow classmates, but he's making it look like he was a little more than eager. He's trying to put in your mind something's wrong with Bryan Kohberger when he literally is just going around making friends, making connections, getting phone numbers, these kind of things. But he still somehow paints it as a socially awkward Bryan Kohberger who has no friends. And as Roberts tells it, Bryan would just chatter away nonstop. Sports, music, his rural Pennsylvania roots. Bryan, out to win friends, was a master of small talk. Okay, Mr. Howard Blum, which one effing is it? Is he an incel awkward guy who has no friends at the school, as the media is continually perpetrating? The media continues to tell you this guy had no friends, so he couldn't have committed the crime with other people because Bryan has no friends. He's socially awkward. He's an incel. He's by himself. He's a loner. And yet we hear, even as they're painting, even as Howard Blum wants to paint the picture that this is the kind of person that he is, he's telling you he's going out making friends. He's easy to talk to. He talks about sports and music and rural Pennsylvania. He's a master of small talk, and yet somehow also awkward and can't make friends. When in the classroom, Howard Blum continues, he was a star. I'm going to skip down. Bryan always had something to say. When he spoke, his fellow students listened with attention. An incredibly strong student, Roberts acknowledged. Once again, Howard Blum will simultaneously tell you Bryan Kohberger is good at making friends, good at small talk, head of his class, and when he talks he has the respect of his classmates, and still will spin it as he's socially awkward and having problems in school and was about to get kicked out. How he does that, I don't know. Howard Blum, I think shame on you for that shit. Like, you're simultaneously telling us how good of a student he is and how social he is while trying to tell us that it's all an act, it's all for show. He's really not that. Even though he's doing all these things, he's really not that. He's not the great student. He's not super social. It's just all a show. It's just an act. In class after class, he made it clear that he wanted to follow in the accomplished footsteps of Dr. Catherine Ramsland. Like his mentor, he would specialize in forensic psychology. It was a discipline, he believed, that could open formidable doors, concealing dangerous secrets. That paragraph right there was simply to reiterate Catherine Ramsland is the professor who literally wrote the book on the serial killer BTK. So he wants to repeat to you, he's obsessed with Catherine Ramsland. He wants everybody to know he studied under Catherine Ramsland. Well, it would be a prestigious thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're obsessed with serial killers, but he wants to implant that in the mind. I guarantee you that's what Howard Blum's doing. I know how these things work. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to make little subtle things to your head as you read it. Oh yeah, okay. He's awkward in school. He's putting on a show. He's a chameleon. He knows how to look like he's a good student and he's outwardly social, but it's all an act because he's really a serial killer and he's obsessed with BTK. Maybe not. It's horseshit writing. It's good writing, to be fair. He writes well, but it's not accurate in my opinion. It's a biased slant. Nevertheless, there's this one element to the exhilarating show that Bryan was putting on on this semester classroom that left many of the students with some disturbing misgivings. So again, he refers to everything Bryan Kohberger does, all of the evidence that he's social and makes friends easy, even with women, and just repeatedly tells you it's a show, it's not real. Then he gives you his evidence why. When any of the female students spoke up, Bryan would go on the attack. He'd rip away at their arguments with a particularly dogged vehemence. A barrage of pointed questions would burst forth. A caustic determination would challenge every assertion. I have to question Howard Blum's diligence. Is it every female, or was it a couple of females who, as he said to his father, the university apparently doesn't believe in intellectual integrity because they wrote poor papers, and he had the nerve to tell them they wrote poor papers. So was it every female student? Is that Howard Blum's interpretation, that it's every female student, or was it just a couple? Anyways, but as the term continued and it became clearer that his combative outbursts were only launched against women in the seminar, people began to wonder if Bryan's taunting was a misogynist weapon. What people? We don't know. But Howard Blum's going to tell us that everyone is acting like now everybody thinks he's a misogynist. And this is the media spin that has been going on for years. Bryan Kohberger is an incel, awkward loner who's a misogynist and hates women because he's not good with them, despite the fact that Howard Blum himself will tell you that he can pick up women's phone numbers and he's out there making small talk like a master. All right. Perhaps he had dreamed about having power for so long now that it was an actuality. he was determined to savor it. So again, now he's telling us that Bryan Kohberger's on a power trip. He loves that he's an authority, that people listen to him, that other students respect him, and that he gets to grade people's papers, and he's having a power trip. Where did that come from? This is Howard Blum's predisposing you against Kohberger over and over and over again. To hear his bullied students tell it. Howard, come on. To hear his bullied students tell it, Bryan's arrogance lay deep. His responses to questions about the text or Professor Snyder's lectures were condescending, if not outright mocking, and he enjoyed bearing opposing views in a cascade of disdain. So he's smart. He knows how to debate, and he wants to show that he knows the subject matter as well or better than his professor. That doesn't necessarily mean he's a misogynist or an incel or awkward. It may be awkward that he's countering his professors, but it could be just a student who, I've seen lots of people who think that they're really, really smart and want to be recognized as being smart. And earlier, Howard Blum told us when Bryan Kohberger talks, other students listen. But now all of a sudden it's a horrible trait. And now they talk basically in this paragraph, and I don't need to read this whole thing, that the professor is beginning to lose his patience with Bryan because it seemed that he was having a run-in with females and he was getting tired of this. And so basically he started to, this professor started to put together a paper trail to essentially, as Howard Blum is going to try to lay it out, to basically start working Bryan Kohberger on his way out of school. That he's basically starting to start a paper trail to document that Bryan Kohberger isn't fit for the doctoral program, at least not for the teaching assistance program, and that would in turn lead to losing his funding, which would in turn lead to him leaving school. And so this teacher has decided to start doing this, to start documenting the work. And he also, this teacher wrote to a fellow professor, Melanie Angela Newelly, the department head, whose research field was violence and violent death, to inform her that they might have a loose cannon as a TA. Dutifully, she met with Bryan on October 3rd to lay down the law. So this professor decides that he's going to start documenting that Bryan Kohberger's got run-ins with females. He goes to the department head. He tells her. They meet with Bryan Kohberger on October 3rd. This is one of several meetings that have been documented repeatedly in the media as proof that Bryan Kohberger is a misogynist. Professor Snyder was not done, however. On October 21, about midway through the term, he sent Bryan an exhaustive email enumerating the ways in which you have failed to meet your expectations as a TA so far this semester. End quote. So in other words, this is in writing. So that Howard Blum is pointing this out. Bryan Kohberger was failing to meet his expectations as a TA. Bryan wouldn't need to read too closely between the lines to gauge the implicit threat. Lose your TA job, you also lose your scholarship funding. And without the $26,000 or so needed to cover the annual costs of grad school, Bryan's matriculation into the university would come to an abrupt end. So again, what Howard Blum wants to paint is Bryan Kohberger was being threatened of losing his TA job. If he loses his TA job, he loses his scholarship. If he loses his scholarship, then he can't afford school and he's going to drop out. So therefore, in your mind, he wants you to believe Bryan Kohberger realizes his world's coming to an end. He's not going to make it in grad school because they're going to kick him out. And so something snaps. That's kind of the logic path. On December 7th, Newelly, Willidis, and Snyder, this is the other professor, sat in a united force on one side of a long table in Johnson Hall. Bryan took his place opposite of them. This is this big confrontation. They made Bryan sweat, but the verdict was, while not perfect, the professors agreed with muted enthusiasm, there was progress. So Bryan Kohberger had been addressed about some problems that somebody's having with him, a professor's having with him. He had been, addressed by the department head, and when they got together to meet and discuss it, they admitted with some muted enthusiasm that there was progress. Were you in that meeting, Howard Blum? Do you know it was muted enthusiasm? Who told you it was muted enthusiasm? But this is a way to write it to say, like, yeah, so they kind of admitted he was on the right path and he had made progress to fixing his problems, but they were really not really believing it. It was muted enthusiasm. And with that, it seemed Bryan just had to make it through another 5 days, and then he'd be heading back with his dad to Pennsylvania because it's the end of the semester coming up, and so he's escaped, he's dodged the bullet at this moment. His scholarship is in check for the next semester. It too would be in the mail, and he would return to his TA job in January. But that's what Bryan Kohberger thought. That's apparently not how it went down, because then we find out this would not happen, because in an instant, all of the progress the TA had made towards a more professional and respectful demeanor turned to sand. Snyder was fit to be tied, and he reached out once again to the department chair, and she sent an email to Bryan's requesting that they meet. This was not most likely a summons to the gallows, but before this execution could take place, this was most likely a summons to the gallows. But before the execution could take place, in other words, before they can cut off his TA funding, Bryan quite effectively placed the noose around his own neck. Several of his female students reported to the department that Bryan was making them feel uncomfortable. In fact, that creepy TA had even followed one of the women to her car. Now there was nothing further to discuss. Bryan's job was over. Mr. Kohberger, this is a quote, "I am writing this letter to formally inform you of your termination of your teaching assistantship with the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, effective December 31, 2022. So now he's lost his TA apprenticeship, which means he's going to lose funding. He's not going to get his scholarship money. He's dropping out. This, again, is preloading you to this is why he snapped and decided to do something. Although, keep in mind, that all happens after. His termination letter is dated, did they say it was the 7th? I think it was the 7th of December, and it's effective December 31st. The murders happened November 13. So the murders had already happened for over a month, or had been over for a month. Bryan Kohberger continued. Let's not forget this. Bryan Kohberger had continued to go to school, to go to classes after the murders. Nobody has picked up. Nowhere have I seen in any mainstream media source, anybody, that, even despite all the people who believe that Bryan Kohberger is guilty of sin, no one has said and come forward to say Bryan Kohberger was acting strangely after the murders. Bryan Kohberger went right back to classes and continued out the rest of the semester. And aside from this losing his TA position at the end of December 31st, meaning they're not going to carry him for next semester. Other than that, everything looked fine. Nobody was saying he was acting strange, that he was doing something different. It was the same Bryan Kohberger as before, and yet he allegedly had just killed 4 people and somehow goes back to class like nothing happened, and no one has noticed anything different in his behavior. To me, that in itself is telling. Now, Bryan Kohberger didn't receive this letter. By the time that the letter was mailed to his apartment in Pullman, Bryan had already left campus and was driving back to Pennsylvania. So he didn't even know at this point that he was going to be terminated from the doctorate program. And so on the morning of December 15th, as the Hyundai continued on its way to the enticing Thai restaurant outside Indianapolis, Bryan was avidly explaining to his father that there was no legal way that the department would ever be able to strip him of his TA job. So Bryan Kohberger is, allegedly, according to this conversation with his father in the car, worried about losing his TA job, but he's thought it through, and he's like, they can't just fire me. They can't just cut my TA job. There has to be a defense. I have to be able to go in there. There were rules, it says, for an appeals process, Bryan explained. It would be impossible for the department to dismiss him without giving him the chance to have his say. A hearing was necessary, and when he had his day, he was confident that he would triumph. He had started making an inventory of all the ways that he had been wronged, and he wanted his father to know that he was determined not to walk off without putting up a fight. The students, he complained, had plotted against him because they were too lazy to do the required coursework. Okay, so here we have it. Is again, what do you want to choose to believe? If you choose to believe Bryan Kohberger did these murders, then you want to choose everything that makes him look bad. He was a failing student. He was getting cut from his TA scholarship because he hated women and he was a misogynist. Or if you want to give him the presumption of doubt, if you want to give him the presumption of innocence and the thought process to say, is there another way of looking at it? He was social. He had a high academic mind. He believed in academic integrity. He believed there was a few female students, or a couple of female students in particular, who were not up to academic standards, and when he called them on it, they reported him as just not liking women, and he was going to get driven out. And he believed when he would have his chance to explain things that he could prove to them it was just lazy classwork, lazy coursework on these part of these women. But again, the narrative has stuck to this day that he's a misogynist that can't handle and doesn't like women. And then that's how that chapter ends, and we go into the children's story. Now I'm interested to hear what Howard Blum is going to tell us about the children. There's tons of things that I know about the children, about Kaylee Gonzalez and Maddie Mogan, who are best friends, who came from Coeur d'Alene, along with Jack DeCoeur, Kaylee's boyfriend, not lifetime, but long-term boyfriend, 5 or 6 years, high school sweethearts that came to Moscow, Idaho together from Idaho. And their friend Xana Kernodle, who was from Post Falls, Idaho, who happened to hang out a lot in Coeur d'Alene with them. All of these individual students came from Coeur d'Alene, with the exception of Ethan Chapin, who started dating Xana, but didn't come from Coeur d'Alene. But three of the four victims came from Coeur d'Alene, along with Kaylee Gonzalez's boyfriend, Jack DeCoeur. So I know all these things. Will he cover that in here, or will he gloss over it? We'll see. But I just wanted to end this chapter with another reminder. This book is very, in my opinion, very biased. The more I read it, the more I realize Howard Blum has an agenda, which is to make sure to paint for you the notion that Bryan Kohberger was awkward socially, putting on a show or an act. He really isn't the social nice guy that some people think he was. That was just a show. The real him is arrogant, disdainful, misogynist, hates women, awkward, incel, all these things. That's the real Bryan Kohberger. What everybody else saw from him, all of the other stuff was just a show. So that shows you the intellectual integrity, I guess, of Howard Blum. Now, to be fair, you might argue, as I close today, as I'm going to close, we're ahead of schedule, so I can take a moment to do a rant. You may argue that I'm doing the same thing, that I'm making every excuse that I can for Bryan Kohberger. Why would I do that? Why would I do that? You know why? Because we believe in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty in the court of law. All too often, people are basically condemned by the media before they even have their first day in trial. Everyone in America is making up their mind the kind of man that Bryan Kohberger is before he has his first day in trial. And it becomes from things like this, by people like Howard Blum, who tell us what he is. He's a monster. He's obsessed with serial killers. He hates women. He's not good with women. He's got mental issues. He was dropping out of school. That narrative that gets put in the public, that becomes basically a trial by fire. And Bryan Kohberger has already had a trial of sorts in the American world view. He's already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. There are most people, I would say, most people are ready to convict Bryan Kohberger without a second thought. For them, there's no question. His DNA was all over the crime scene. Even though there's no link between him and the victims, he just didn't like women in particular. They probably didn't like him when he came onto one of them, and he got rebuffed, and therefore he got pissed and killed everybody. That's okay with most people. So again, my mini rant is now coming to a close. Again, I would say Bryan Kohberger has been convicted in the court of public opinion by things like Howard Blum, who don't believe apparently in the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, because he's really laying down the narrative thick on why Bryan Kohberger is exactly the guy who did these murders. So take that for what it is. I will try to do my best to present a little bit of a defense, a little bit of a counter. And again, I will say one last time, Bryan Kohberger may be guilty of this. I think that there's a strong possibility he was involved. Whether or not he went into the house, I'm not sure about that. Whether Bryan Kohberger could have actually done the amount of killings that he did in the time that they say he did, I really have doubts. I just did a video, by the way, on my Devil's Briefcase called Combatives, that talks about what kind of skills would you need to kill 4 people on 2 floors in about 10 minutes. What kind of skills would that need? Is it Bryan Kohberger's skills, or somebody who's trained in knife fighting and combatives, as the military would call it? So if you want to check that out, you can see my counter to that. Again, I'm just giving reasonable doubt and food for thought. Is it possible Bryan Kohberger isn't all these things they say he is, and this is just the narrative that we paint because we want to feel better when we convict him? With that, I say, thank you for listening to this. We're at the end of part 1. I plan on continuing with this book series. I am also doing Luigi's Bookshelf, An American Sickness, in the same style as this. I was almost ready to give up on that. It's a very depressing book, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better, but I keep getting encouragement that people enjoy that style of delivery. So I'm going to continue on Luigi's Bookshelf. I'm going to continue on Bryan Kohberger's book, When the Night Comes Falling. Until next chapter, thanks for listening. And subscribe, by the way, and like and put notification bells and all those good things that help me out. Leave a comment, interact, so I can get these things out to more people and keep building momentum. All right, that's enough. Good night.